Okay, well, one of the things that's really become clearer as I've done these interviews, or a couple things, were
Yeah,
the importance of certain sectors of the economy, which pretty much didn't exist in Soviet times.
yeah,
And, real estate being one of them. You don't have private ownership, you don't have a real estate market, obviously. So the development of that and the role of foreigners in the development of the real estate industry, particularly Americans, is really something of interest that I obviously want to focus on with you.
great.
And then once we sort of work our way through that, what is the size of the role of foreigners and Americans in the current real estate market? It's we all, as Americans, we sort of take ourselves as the reference point to judging things, and I want to try and step out of that for a minute and put it in context. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I would like to start with the development of that market post-Soviet times, and particularly so what brought you to Russia, when, and how your career developed there.
Okay, great. Maybe just as a bit of background, I don't know if you have any information about the company I work for, but we're one of the largest real estate developers and investors in the world. So I think about 160 billion in assets. You may know some of our projects in Boston. We're doing the South Station development right now. We've done several things in Back Bay with Robert Stern, Philip Johnson, et cetera. So we're a large real estate developer and investor.
Okay.
And I was working for Hines. And if you need any background information, it's and I think my CV is on. I'm on our executive committees, which is our board of directors for our global firm and our global investment committee. But I didn't start out that way. I was working for Hines in the United States, in the state of Texas at the time, back in the early 90s. And I've been working for this firm for about 5 years, when things obviously started happening internationally and in Europe as the Berlin Wall fell. And back to the point about why I ultimately decided to make a move over to Russia, mostly because I've always had a bit of a spirit of adventure, and so there wasn't any master plan of me going over to change the world or anything of that nature. But I'd always been interested in this. In fact, I was in Prague during the Velvet Revolution back in '89, there on Vyacheslav Square. And so the entire transition just really intrigued me tremendously. And at the time, we had two of our board members that were charged with looking at activities or potential markets that we might move into. One of them was charged with looking at Western Europe. And we ultimately set up an office in Berlin for the same reason, because of the transition from the communist era Berlin to the modern era. And set up an office in Berlin. That was the first office in Europe. And then my boss, who was a board member, whose position ultimately I took over when he retired, was looking at Eastern Europe. So we looked at everything from Czech Republic, Poland, Russia, and we ultimately decided that we would open up an office in Russia because, and this was actually before the Soviet Union fell, which is kind of interesting. We did one of the first joint ventures in real estate with an entity called UPDK.
Okay.
And just to give you a little bit of background, this entity was set up back in the 20s to look after embassy facilities, of embassies, and to provide services to diplomats. So UPDK stands for the Main Administration for Services to Diplomatic Corps. And most people viewed them as a KGB front organization to look after, basically spy on and look after the foreigners. That was why they were set up in the 20s. Well, what happened is they had a lot of real estate. They had the embassies and they had excess cash flow that came from the foreign payments in hard currency from embassies. And so what they did was they started building a project that was commercially oriented, but they didn't have any idea about how to attract commercial tenants. So we negotiated with them a deal that we signed in 1991, so before the Soviet Union fell, and we negotiated a joint venture to take over this project in Moscow called Park Place Moscow. And Hines, now that was actually before my time. There was a guy before me that negotiated the joint venture, but they needed somebody to run it.
Right.
And so,
can I just ask you a quick question? Do you know how Hines and the UPEC,
you call it UPDK,
UPDK, how UPDK found each other?
Yeah, it was another kind of interesting story. If you remember back in, I guess, I can't remember when it was, but when Soviet Union began letting Jewish people out of the Soviet Union, there was a guy who was named Michael Barash, who was basically, he was a concert violinist. He left the Soviet Union, somehow wound up in Fort Worth, Texas, decided he couldn't really make any money as a concert violinist, so he got involved with real estate as a broker and got to know Hines, our firm, through one of our big projects in Dallas called the Dallas Galleria, which we developed a big project there. So when I think he maybe read a press report that Hines was looking at going into Eastern Europe or going into Berlin and other places, he contacted us and said, look, I can go back, and now that things are really changing dramatically, and if you don't mind me going in and effectively trying to find people that may be interested in connecting with international businesses, I'll do that. And so he went over there. He went to Moscow, came here, and he was a broker, basically a real estate broker. And he ultimately ran into and met with the UPDK guys, and then he introduced us. They were interested in how do they take their old mentality of just managing embassies to now a very big commercial complex, which you need to lease out to corporates and lease out both housing and offices. And how do they complete a project, because they were doing this first development. They'd never done a development of this scale. So he introduced us, and we ultimately signed up the joint venture. That was also at a time where Russia was very anxious to engage with and do these joint ventures, and the Soviet Union was.
Yeah.
So we did, I think it was the first real estate joint venture with this group called UPDK. Then the deal was we came in and we couldn't own the real estate, so it was a bit complicated. We put last money in and it became first money out. And in exchange for that, we then had a deal with them for 20 years where we would get a share of cash flow. It worked out to be roughly 11% of the cash flow for this project for 20 years. And I remember everyone saying to us at the time, and then anyway, long story short, they needed somebody to go run the business. I was, there was a memo that was sent around the offices of Hines.
Right.
I said, this is interesting. I raised my hand. I said, I'll go there for 2 years. I'll commit to 2 years. And that was in 1992. I came over here on April of 93. So April 15th of 1993. And I'm still here almost 27 years later.
Wow. Wow. 2-year commitment morphed into 27, 28.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you know any Russian when you came over?
No, I didn't. I didn't know any Russian at all. And I was a young guy for adventure, and this is what I did.
Right. And this was the Park Place project. Is that? It sounds so familiar, but remind me, where is it?
It's in Yugo-Zapадnaya, on Leninsky Prospect.
Okay.
So it is
Is it
fairly,
near Paveletskaya?
no, it's not. It's quite a bit away from the center.
Okay.
So Yugozapadnaya is, it's not, we're probably 3 kilometers out from the outer orbital than MCAD. So 3 or 4 maybe. And that was our first project. Everyone told us that a lot of the people that we knew said, yeah, they signed a 20-year agreement. They'll never live up to it. They'll kick you out, etc. And the Russian government lived up to it to a T. They lived up to it fully.
Yeah.
And in fact, we extended a little bit longer than that. We no longer have that project, but we did it, I think, for 22 years.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
that's what got me here.
and was it targeted toward foreign tenants and foreign residents?
Yes, it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
And we had both offices and residential. And so, basically, if you were a small company trying to set up a representative office, it worked out well because you could have your residents in part of the complex,
Right.
and have a small office in another part. And, it worked out well.
And there, at that time, there weren't too many alternatives.
Not really, no.
That was Rasinka was there at that
That
time.
later, Rasinkin happened probably, I would say, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was probably 96, maybe 95, 96, so 2 or 3 years later.
2 or 3 years later.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And what is the other one? Pokrovsky
Pokrovsky Hills.
Hills. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that was, maybe I'll just give you a brief, that was our project as well. So we did that.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of the story. Okay. Yeah.
So basically we did that first project, and then we did a second project with Upadakal. And then we did some management projects. We did Ducat Place 2, which was a management project. And then by 1996, that we decided that Hines was doing a global emerging markets private equity fund. And it was a concept that was brand new. Nobody had really thought about a real estate emerging markets fund. And we ultimately committed about 25% of the capital from that first fund into the Pokrovsky Hills project.
Wow.
So originally, Pokrovsky Hills, we planned to do it for about $80 million, but we ultimately, because of various changes in tax legislation, et cetera, we invested $100 million of equity in that project. And it was, something that came about from the early days at Park Place, Moscow. We knew that the Anglo-American school was desperate for some new modern facilities. They'd come to us to ask us, is there anything we could do to help? And around that same time, we did a project in Prague where we did International School of Prague plus housing as part of a project, and it was working very well. So we decided that we'd do the same thing here in Russia. And I went to the mayor of Moscow, Lushkov, and asked, for some support. He didn't really give support per se, but he, had one of the city guys try to help us in finding a site, and went to the ambassador, U.S. ambassador at the time. And the idea was we'll put school together, and then the U.S. embassy would be the anchor lessee, the anchor tenant, and lease 40 houses from us for a 8-year period. And on the basis of that, we could put the deal together, acquire the land, and then develop the Pokrovsky Hills, which is ultimately what we did.
So
But we had
and with the anchor tenant and the commitment, you were able to have the financial backing to do that. Then,
well, yeah, we funded it all equity.
yeah.
But the school had to fund it themselves, which they did through selling seat fees in advance. So the school had some capital, and then they sold seat fees. So they'd go to a corporate, and the corporate would say, I'll commit to 5 students, and I'll pay you a seat fee of, it was maybe 15,000 or so. So, I'll give you $75,000 for the right to have 5 students in the school.
Right.
and they went through all these corporates, and then ultimately they got a loan from Raiffeisen Bank, but they had to have the guarantee from three governments: the U.S. Embassy, the British Embassy, and the Canadian Embassy. And great story at the time. Before they had one final approval to get for the embassies. It was the British Embassy, and the banker was in the closing room, and he said, we've got to have the okay, the green light from the British. So they called the embassy, and then the embassy basically put them through the Buckingham Palace, and the assistant, this is the story, I think it's true. The banker told me it was true. He said that the aide to the Queen said, Her Majesty fully supports the school. And with that, the loan was closed for the school. And so the school went forward, which meant our project went forward, and then we built out all of Pokrovsky Hills.
Wow.
But we had a few tough moments. In the midst of our first phase, the price of oil plummeted to about $8 a barrel, and we were sweating quite a lot on that. But we kept going, and ultimately, it turned out beautifully. We ultimately sold it and made about $200 million of profit on the $100 million investment. So it was the most profitable deal we had in our entire global emerging markets fund.
Wow. Yeah, that's very impressive. And how many units was it when you built it out?
207 units of housing, and then the school was a school for about 1,250 students. So we didn't finance the school, except that we gave them land and we built all their utilities. So we basically financed the land and the utilities, and then the school paid for the vertical themselves through this loan and the capital contributions. And then we built out all the houses. Embassy leased 40, and then we leased out the rest of it to basically corporates.
Right. And was it always your intention to build it and sell it to a permanent owner?
Yeah, that's, these private equity funds, that's the entire idea, is that we build and add, we create the value, and then ultimately we exit. So we've done several of these. In Russia now, we've funded things through, let me think, three global private equity funds. The total of each of those was about 1.4 billion, of which around a quarter of it went to Russia. Then we had a number of other what we call separate accounts, or one investor, and then Hines, and then we've done a series of one-off deals where we would finance things just with us and one other investor for a single project.
And so there was no real funding for this inside Russia at the time, correct? I mean, there's
right. In the early days, so we did the early days. We did all of our projects with debt. I mean, with equity only. So we did it 100% equity through our private equity funds. We did the same with our Ducat Place 3 project and Ducat Place Complex. We did that, which was on a subsequent fund. That was an office building. So the first deal we did was residential. The next major investment we did was office. And, we actually had a great success on that one too. It was, at the time we sold our Ducat Place office building, it was the single most profitable office deal, single project we had done in the entire Hines history globally throughout the entire, history of our firm, which is since the 1950s. So it was very, very successful.
Wow. And how long did it take you to sell Pokrovsky Hills?
I think we sold it. We started the project in '97, and we sold it in 2005 or six, I believe. Five, I think.
Okay. And to a Russian owner?
No. We sold it to AIG and Deutsche Bank.
Okay.
And then, actually, interesting enough, we then bought it back with Goldman Sachs and then we sold it again to a large Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund. By that time we sold it to the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund, the final price was 370 million on this project that we built for 100 million. So
Wow.
quite successful.
Yeah, good.
Now, in fairness, the values now with the price of oil and with the ruble are down fairly dramatically to probably, 2/3 of that 370. So maybe even a little bit less.
Yeah, yeah. So the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund has had to take the weight of that.
They have, yes.
Yeah. So, interesting. So, and the Ducat similarly to a large investment group?
Now that we sold that to a Russian company called O1. So yeah, and that we sold in, let's see, we finished it in 2006, and we sold that to O1 Properties in 2012, I believe. So about 6 years later.
Right.
Normally, the kind of hold period that we do can range from around 3 to 5 years, 3 to 6 years after we finish it.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And this must have been kind of a star inside the Hines world that you were able to make these kinds of returns.
Yes, it was a very good story. I would say the great story went from around 2000 to 2014. And then following 2014, as politics intervened with the Crimea affair, and then oil prices weakened, the last 6 years have been more challenging. Although we've done quite a number of other things. We've done. I can give you a couple statistics. So the amount of assets that we've developed were about 1.6 billion US, the value of everything that we've developed, and then we've acquired about 2.2 billion. So just under 4 billion in assets over this period in Russia. And the development has been started with Pokrovsky, then office buildings, then warehousing, and then retail, and then we started buying offices, warehousing, and retail. We bought a large mall, and then various assets. So we've gotten, probably I would say the most challenging period has been between 15 and really 19. So that period of time, for that 4 years, was probably the most challenging.
And so, is the majority of your business and operating and managing existing assets more than currently being development?
No, we're still doing development. We've got, in fact, this project that's on my screensaver. This one, you can see, this was an outlet mall outlet project that we just completed with Gucci, Ralph Lauren, Loro Piano, Valentino, about 100 tenants. This is one that we just completed in June of last year.
Yeah.
And I can show you, just images are probably a little bit easier. I'll show you a couple other ones. Hold on a second. This was one of our first outlet villages that we did with Bella Dacia. Finished the last phase a couple of years ago, and then we did another project. This is one in, let's see, this one right here. This is in St. Petersburg. You can see that?
Yeah.
This one, we just finished the last phase also last year. So last year, we finished 2 outlets in 2020, the last phase of this one and the first phase of the first screensaver.
Yeah.
And we're starting the next phase of this one. Sorry, we started the next phase of the first one that I had on the back next year. So we're still doing development, and we have about 3 billion of assets under management right now.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And you you started in Moscow, and most of the projects you mentioned have been in Moscow, except for the one you just showed me in St. Pete. So have you ventured outside of Moscow beyond St. Pete, or what?
Well, my responsibilities are actually in a number of countries. So in Russia, we have just Moscow and St. Pete. And then in Poland and Czech Republic, we have Prague, and then 11 cities in Poland. And then in India, which is also my responsibility, and we have now 4 cities in India.
Wow.
So
Got a big geographic spread to cover, and
yeah,
cultural too.
yeah.
Yeah. So how would you describe sort of the general state of the real estate market and when you started? I mean, you had a particular strength and international connections, and an excellent partner to begin with. But what did the market in general look like to you when you entered it?
Well, there was nothing. That I would say probably the thing that people would never always were surprised about is the head count of how many people we had, how many employees we had, and much of that was because you didn't have anything. We hired our own security guards, we hired our own cleaning companies, we hired our own teachers to do Montessori schools, we hired our own people to run our health, our health clubs, drivers, accountants, leasing people, engineers, property managers, development personnel. So, the count at its peak was probably around 300 people in Russia. Today we have a lot, and the 300 people with only a couple projects. Now we have still a very big head count, about 220 people, but a lot more projects, assets that are, the first 2 projects, which are probably $300 million. We had almost 300 people. Now we have $3 billion and we have 200 people. So
Yeah.
that's probably the big difference. And, in the early days, I mean, you couldn't pay your people. You had to pay them in cash. It was just nothing really. But people learned, people grew. We've had a couple different guys within our business that went out, struck out, like probably 4 or 5 companies that have struck out on their own and been very, very successful. Spin-offs, not spin-offs, that's not the right word, but outgrowths of our firm with Russian companies that have become very, very successful. One group called AB Development, which is very successful, run by a guy that we hired originally as a health club attendant, and now he's one of the best and strongest developers in Moscow. We had another company called another guy named Michael Belton, who then started a firm called Storm Development, and then he had some spinoffs from his. So probably 4 or 5 companies that have come out of our firm, and so I think in many ways that was probably a relatively large legacy that's happened from our business.
Yeah.
Then we also, while early on we had private equity funds, which would be institutional investors around the world that we would pool the capital. So pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, people like GM, CalPERS, California Pension Fund, New York State Teachers Retirement. Later on, we had groups like several sovereign funds from Korea, from UN Pension Fund. So a lot of these global investors came in to Russia for the first time with us. GIC, Government of Singapore, was one of our early investors. But then later on, we began having local partners. So we had the partner that started one of the largest mobile telephone companies, the Zeman family, that then set up They were a partner on Ducat Place 3. With us, they made around 100 million of profit. And then they've set up what is now, was kind of the Russian version of the Carnegie Endowment. It was called Dynasty Fund. And they funded.
What was it again?
Dynasty Fund.
Dynasty Fund? Yeah.
And they basically funded the arts and engineering and education in Russia. Their entire mandate was to try to keep Russian engineers and talent in Russia. To fund this. And we had, we contributed a pretty meaningful amount of capital to that fund through the profits we made on a joint two projects. They did Ducat Place 2 and Ducat Place 3 with us.
Again, which mobile phone were they connected with? Which company?
They started Beeline.
Okay.
It's the family is called the Zeman family, Zinin. It's Dr. Dmitry Zeman and his son Boris Zeman. And they started doing one-off developments with us, and then they became investors with us elsewhere around the world. And we've continued to do things. You might do a web search, and this is about Boris Zeman and Alexei Navalny. You might find that interesting if you do a web search on that.
Okay.
After you do that, you'll understand it more about the significance of what I just told you.
Okay.
Anyway, so they were a partner. And then we had other partners with a group called Belaya Dacha, which was an agribusiness firm that did a lot of work with McDonald's. With them, we developed warehousing and our first outlet center. And then the outlet center that's behind us, they were our partner on that. And so, we've had a number and then we did partnerships with a group called UFG. So we've had a number of, so the first part were the private equity companies. Then we did Russian partners, and we were engaged with various Russian groups, partnering with them, selling to them, buying from them, spin-offs that happened from our company through development. So, I guess the point is, as I read your summary, the premise was America's engagement in Russia was a failed experiment. In my judgment, nothing could be farther from the truth.
Okay. I took that point of view because I read it in the academic literature, and it was almost a provocation, if you will. So as I've gone along, there have been many of the people I've interviewed have said the exact same thing as you have. It just causes me to change the title of this book. I don't want to be, like I'm sure you've dealt with many journalists. They have a story and they look for quotes to support the story that they've already thought up. I don't want to do that. I want this book to reflect what I'm hearing through the interviews. And what I'm hearing through the interviews is there's a long-lasting impact not appreciated very well. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely fair. I mean, I think about, we as a developer, we think about the built environment. How can we change cities to make them more beautiful, more long-lasting, more enjoyable? And if we do that well, we'll make a good profit from it. We'll succeed financially. And I guess my view is we have tried and we have, I believe, succeeded in creating great projects, and people that used to work for us have now started companies that created projects. And Moscow is a better place. St. Petersburg is a better place for that. And I think, we and the people that have worked for me, partners that have partnered with us, I think are very, very, proud about that. And I think, there has been success, both financial as well as physical success, that I think has come from this. And, and I also think we've had probably, if I were to think about all the people that have worked through, come through our company over time, that have, I think, hopefully we've instilled a way of doing business, proper, fair dealing, high, all of the things that you want to see. That is kind of the, I would say the prototypical American mentality of, I wouldn't just say American, but international mentality of how to do things well. We've had maybe 1,500 people, maybe 2,000 people that have come through our organization, and it could be even more. That hopefully are adding to the communities that we're working in, and businesses and life, and and et cetera. So I think the effect is going to be long lasting.
Uh-huh.
We're pretty proud about it, actually.
Right. So you were kind of the part of the internationalization of Russian economic life, and also helped bring successful Russians into the world economy as well, right? Is that fair?
I think I think so. Whether it's consultants, banks. I mean, now our largest lenders are the two largest Russian banks, Sberbank and VTB. They had never done an international oriented real estate loan until they did it with us. Now we have $1 billion of lending from Sberbank and $400 million from VTB. And these are banks that I think, I mean, it would be presumptuous to say we taught them about that, but certainly we said, this is how we approach it. And, we began to do lending on that. So I think it's it's not just people and projects, but it's also bankers, engineering companies, contractors, subcontractors, now Russian contractors. We started building a project with international contractors, Italian, Swedish, Skanska, Turkish, and now our contractors are completely Russian. They are a standard of quality that is absolutely as good as you find anywhere in the world. And so what you're seeing behind us, or the St. Petersburg project, we're all Russian contractors. So that's hopefully an impact as well.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, that's a hugely significant change. In a sense, sort of, I remember reading about McDonald's and how long it took them to build out their supply chain and to guarantee the back end. And I said this to someone I spoke to the other day about restaurants, and they said opening the restaurant was only the beginning. It was the behind the scenes logistics support and training of staff that was even much more impactful than the physical restaurant itself. And it sounds like there's a kind of analogous story here for you.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the contractors we have today started off as subcontractors for the international contractors, and now they started their own firm, and they've grown and effectively supplanted the international guys. And the same thing happened with banks. The first Russian bank we did lending with, is they participated in a loan that we did with Unicredit, big Italian bank, and Gazprom Bank participated, and then later on they did their own loans directly. It's the same. It's analogous in many ways.
Yeah, yeah. But it's also, obviously you were open to that approach, and you sought out reliable Russian partners, which
absolutely,
yeah.
And I think also the other thing that really, we had a lot of times people thought they came to things with saying your Russian partners are going to screw you, or they're going to steal from you, or they're going to do whatever. Starting with UPDK, and their 20-year contract, which went through exactly 20 years plus 2 years, to our Russian partners, we couldn't have asked for better partners. They were some of the finest partners that we've ever had in the world. And what's interesting about it, though, we chose some partners. We always steered clear from what I would say were the Russian corporate raiders, the guys that were basically stealing assets. We tended to partner with people that built their business like the Zeman family with Beeline, or the Simonov family with Bella Dacia, or Charlie Ryan and his partner, Pavel Fedorov of UFG. These were guys that built their business from the ground up. So they understood what's proper business. What does having a good partner mean? What does a contract mean? How do we get trade supplies from suppliers? If you're a mobile telephone company, you have to get equipment and you have to honor your contracts. So they understood that, and then they turned out to be fantastic partners on the real estate side. Really.
Yeah. So how do you account for the reputational the reputation that you had to deal with people saying to you? How do you account for how people got the opinion that the Russians were going to steal from you?
Well, some of them, I think, chose the wrong partner that did steal from them. And I remember we were considering one partnership with a major Russian oligarch who he basically made his money through stealing assets at the early phase, but then was trying to do partnership with major institutions. And they were really courting us to join up with them. And I'll never forget, there was a meeting which I had with his various team members. And he came into the room, and I just saw how all of his people responded to him.
Yeah.
And it made me feel extremely uncomfortable that it was just the personal interaction, watching the physical part of how they responded to him, that made me feel like I would not be able to trust this guy. And it turned out that was correct, because a number of years later, he had some partnerships that turned out very badly. I think there were a fair number of international firms that tied up with the Russian oligarchs who were corporate raiders at heart. And it's hard, if that's how you make money at the beginning, which is kind of stealing assets, it's hard to stop doing it that way. And so I would say that's where the reputation came from. And those people deserve that reputation.
Yeah.
Where the kind of partners we had did not.
Yeah. Yeah. But the kind of partners that you have had don't get publicity. So good news is not news, right? Yeah.
Yeah. They're not, most of our partners, today they might be worth $1 billion. At the time we partnered with them, maybe they were worth $100 million. They had some good insights. They built some good businesses, but they weren't the high-flying oligarchs that were worth $5 or $10 billion through their corporate rating. And so, yeah, they weren't really the supplier. One of our partners is the supplier of lettuce and tomatoes to McDonald's. So they made their money by building a business to supply lettuce and tomatoes to McDonald's. Now, you're not going to read about them, but they had good real estate sites, and we partnered with them. So they would be very much under the radar screen. The Zeman family, a little bit higher profile. They built a New York Stock Exchange listed Beeline.
Right.
But we actually managed a building that they owned, and we saw how they treated us as a service provider, a management company, before we together did a $100 million office building. So we were able to see how they dealt with people and make our judgments on that basis.
Right. So as what someone told me very early on in Russia, that while in America they say, the three most important factors in real estate are location, location, location. In Russia, the three most important factors of business are partner, partner, partner. And it sounds like you're confirming that little saying, huh?
Yeah, I would definitely say in the emerging markets. And by the way, Russia's not alone. This is true. This is true in India as well. It's partner, 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 and location, location, location. And then the third thing I would say is quality, quality, quality. So if you build a quality product at the right location, with the right partner, absent some major exogenous shock, you're going to
Right.
do extremely well.
Yeah.
And we have.
Yeah. Yeah. And would you, I mean, how much did those Russian partners add to your success?
I mean, a fair bit. I would say that um, having a partner that's there with you when the going gets tough, as oftentimes happens, is always a critical thing. And what I mean by that is, on our Ducat project, we had some pretty nasty surprises where the city extracted an extra $9 million from us, the city of Moscow did, and it was pretty painful. And then some tax law changes that cost another $10 million. So we went from a project that was planned to be $75 million up to around $96 million. And if you had a really tough partner, and our partner was funding along with us, right?
Right.
So this was pretty tough going stuff. But they stuck with us, and then, as I said, it turned out to be the most successful project we'd had in our history at the time we sold it for. We again sold it for about $370 million on a $96 million investment, so it was extremely successful.
Right. 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 Right.
And the other aspect, the partner was on another project. They were responsible. They had the utility connections, and that was an important point. Land entitlement, that was an important point. So all of those things, I think, are really, really critical issues.
Right. Right. So how important were political connections of your partners?
It varied. Our partner, the Zeman family, they didn't really do anything except contribute a site and capital, and we handled everything directly with the city. And Bella Bacha, another partner, they were more important because they were the biggest taxpayer in the satellite city on the edge of Moscow. So they definitely had the ability to make the phone call and get the city to. We were very, very careful because of the FCPA and all of those things. We were very careful with our partners to say, no kidding. This is no kidding. We've got to. So if the city is going to come back and require something more of us, we will pay it, but we will not pay a bribe. And our partners were fantastic in this way. At the same time, when you're the largest taxpayer in a district and the largest employer, you have political influence. And our partner was able to exert some political influence to have people do what was required of the city under a relatively good time frame.
Right, right. I mean, it was, of course, an era in which everyone sort of believed that in order to get a license or a utility connection or a electrical connection, you had to grease somebody's palm to get those
we always
utilities. Yeah.
Well, we always had to be smart about how we would manage things. I mean, on our Pekrovsky Hills project, the city was delaying and not giving us approval, and we ultimately did what we will not do in San Francisco or Boston, which was say, look, we will pay for utility capacity for this entire district, and that will be our contribution to the city. And will that be acceptable for you? And they agreed with that. Now, all of the adjacent sites benefited from that, and all of the developers benefited from that.
Right.
But that's the kind of stuff that you can realistically do. So we had to find ways to do that in each of our projects.
Yeah. So you were able to provide a civic benefit rather than someone extracting a personal benefit from it.
Right.
Yeah.
And let's, on a civic benefit, paying for utilities that frees up the development of adjacent sites that are around us after we are doing the development, creating value. So we definitely created value for the adjacent real estate developer, Russian real estate developers that were benefiting from our investment. So
Okay.
definitely.
All right. And did you face pressure to hire someone's nephew or son or brother or any of that kind of stuff?
No, we've never faced that. We've never had that.
Right. Okay. And obviously, I mean, I have to ask these questions because they're perception questions that always come up. But so you didn't have to deal with Krisha, no, squeeze on you from sort of criminal elements that you had to protect yourself from?
We never did.
Yeah.
Now, maybe some of that is we originally had a partnership with what was effectively the Russian government,
Yeah.
and we had that partnership for 20 years. And we did exactly what we were supposed to do, and they did. They were a fantastic partner, and I think that certainly made an impression. That was our initial decision to do that. Again, when the Soviet Union still existed, and I think it was a very, very good thing for us to do.
Yeah. Yeah. But so it's got you on the right path, so to speak. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And did you find that when you first came in the market that people had any idea who you were or the capabilities that you represented?
No, not in Russia. I mean, everybody. Well, Hines as a company is, one of the world's largest. Most people in Russia, the only thing they knew about Heinz was the ketchup. So they thought Heinz was ketchup.
Right.
So, the good news is now they don't. Now our counterparties don't, but certainly at the beginning it was challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. And did you use public relations firms? I mean, how were you in terms of, were you also a source of business services developing in legal and PR and those things? Were those also things that you spawned?
Well, I would say that we certainly helped the businesses of various, whether law firms or um, advertising firms, as we did retail projects in particular. But that, I would say that's more as a client. We were
Right.
clients of all these firms. Um, as I mentioned, the bank before. So yes, we did not do public relations per se, and only the advertising. We certainly advertised, and the advertising became much more meaningful and important once we had a significant investment into retail, because you do a lot more advertising, promotions, things of that nature in retail.
Right.
Uh, just other typical consultants. We're a major client of an Ernst and Young, various law firms, and then mostly the Russian homegrown advertising firms would be the groups that we would hire. We didn't typically do the big McCann Erickson or groups like that.
Uh-huh. 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 And I assume, the demand was pretty high from foreign firms for space and living and office space at the beginning. Has
Yes.
that has that has the demand profile shifted away from foreign firms towards Russian firms, or is it pretty much oriented towards foreign or international firms?
Definitely it's shifted more to, we have a lot more Russian companies, but still, I would say we have a significant amount of foreign firms as well. But you have to keep in mind, let's take retail, for example. We have maybe 700 retail tenants, so quite a large number. All of them, I would say probably 90% are 85 or 90% would be international names. That
Right.
doesn't mean that they're necessarily just international firms, because you might have Russian companies that have the distribution rights or the franchise rights for those international firms.
Right.
So one of our major tenants is a group called Mercury. Now, Mercury is the group that has Zoom, the Zoom department store. Another group
Right.
that we have in Bosco de Chile that has Boom. And then they have franchise rights for Valentino, Loro Piano, and a lot of these franchise rights that they had that they will still operate. So they're Russian companies that have the international name. Then I would say our office tenants, still we probably have about 75% international, but the Russian firms are growing quite a lot. So the Russian firms will get, take more and more space. On our residential, it's about probably 60-40 international versus Russian. And then warehousing is 100% Russian. So all of our tenants in our warehouse project are all Russian.
Wow. And this has been a whole trajectory since when you began to where you are, and I assume projecting further in the future, it's more of this direction, this trajectory. Is that?
Yeah, right? I think so. And certainly, if we do more in residential, obviously our clients will be Russian,
right?
And I think definitely the Russian firms will take a much, and that's the way it should be. I mean, I think as time goes on, you should, of course, have a large part, and maybe even the preponderance, even in the very top end real estate, should be Russian companies. And that's the way it should be.
Yeah. Did you learn Russian, by the way?
I learned reasonably well, not as well as I would like, and which is, I would say, probably the reason why I didn't do as well as I would like. By the way, my wife is Russian, my son is Russian, so we speak reasonable amount of Russian at home, but we also speak a fair amount of English because we're trying to make sure he speaks English.
Yeah.
To a degree.
Right. Yeah, I think almost everybody that I've spoken with who has been successful and integrated, it's the language is obviously crucial to that.
Well, I would say even more so is having Russian friends, right? So I would say that probably, 80% of my friends are Russian, and 20% will be international. So that's also, I think, an important part.
Right. That is an important part. I was always struck at the years when I was traveling back and forth. The companies I worked for were much smaller, obviously, and we rented apartments. I didn't stay in hotels. I later then stayed with friends in Moscow, Russian friends, and I was always struck by there were a portion of the expat community that was so self-contained that one of my Russian friends once described it to me as like treaty port China.
Mm-hmm.
You know what the treaty ports were in China, correct? Right, I'm sure you do. But that some of the institutions were like that. They were a foreign enclave sitting on Russian territory.
Well, I mean, that's what Pekowski Hills for some, and many of the embassies, I mean, they're definitely kind of foreign enclave. And I don't think that's good because I think that, I think there's a lack of cultural understanding that maybe, it's not great for the embassies, frankly. But, that's changing a little bit because now we've got probably 40% of our tenants at Pekowski Hills that are now Russian. So it's changing. And same thing as the international school, more and more Russians going to the international schools.
Right. So, have ambassadors, as they've come and gone, consulted you about Russia and what you've learned about it?
Early on, yes, I would say in recent times, and certainly, I think, recently, I would say there's been so much of a focus on the negative aspects about the Russian-US relations that I wouldn't say that we had people that consult now. I would speak with the ambassadors or either through my role here as being one of the larger landlords of the US, British, and Canadian embassies to and therefore I still have engagement with the embassies to some degree. Not so much the ambassadors. I don't think I've really engaged with the ambassadors for the last 2 or 3 ambassadors, except through my role in the American Chamber of Commerce, where
Uh-huh.
there's connectivity on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you know, and I think, unfortunately, I remember one of my colleagues, friends in business here. His wife was a pretty senior person at the State Department, the U.S. State Department, and his wife asked him speak with some of her American friends that are in Russia and ask them what they would ask, what they would want to ask the Secretary of State. And my question I asked was, do the people in the State Department know anything about history? Because it sure feels like they don't.
Uh, yeah, I bet you didn't get an answer to that, did you?
No, I didn't. But
Yeah.
I would say maybe one of my interesting dinners I had was when I was invited to dinner with the then current ambassador and a previous ambassador, former Secretary of State James Baker, and a number of kind of oligarchs, I would say. Mikhail Friedman was there, and Oleg Pascha was there. And we had an off-the-record comment, and this was right when the reset was happening. I don't know if you remember this.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Right when the reset, and they wanted to have an exchange of opinion and ideas, and that was absolutely really, really fascinating dinner. And it was the dinner at which James Baker, who was the Secretary of State when the Soviet Union came apart, and
Right.
George W. Bush was president. And Baker, I remember him saying, and he's been quoted as saying this before, that he was advocating of bringing Russia into NATO at the time the Soviet Union came apart. And he said, I was not successful with that and definitely had a fair bit of pushback. And it was one of those dinners where people on the political front were saying, what could have been from the politics side. And it was really a fascinating dialogue between, by the way, his counterpart was also at that dinner. So the Soviet foreign secretary was also at that dinner. So it was a fascinating dialogue.
Primakov? Was it?
No, it wasn't Primakov. It was, because Primakov was not the foreign secretary. I forget his name, but he was, as the Soviet Union came apart.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, you're right. Primakov was the prime minister. So
And later, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It was fascinating dinner.
Yeah. But that was many years ago. I mean,
Yeah.
did those kinds of informal exchanges still go on?
Not so much anymore. I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think the informal exchanges, I found from our early partnership with UPDK, it was the informal aspect is as important and perhaps more so than the formal part. Certainly was with us in our engagement with UPDK.
Yeah.
And even, I remember when we had one of our difficult projects, when we were in the midst of trying to work on our approval for the Satinsky Hills project, I wanted to have a meeting with the mayor of Moscow, but it was virtually impossible to get in to meet with him in Moscow. And we found that he was going to be part of this conference in Los Angeles. So I and one of my colleagues got on a, whatever it was, 20-hour flight to fly to Los Angeles so we could sit down with him on an informal basis in Los Angeles to deal with our project in Moscow. And that was critical. I mean, that was what it took.
Yeah. That's funny you would say that. I remember that was often true in that period of time, that people while they were in Russia were so busy, it was impossible to see them. But outside the country, they suddenly had free time because they weren't
Right.
being constantly bombarded, and they actually were easier to talk to. Is
They
that
were easier to talk to. They were more, I would say, constructive in their way of trying to find solutions. And it was, yeah, I mean, it was. I took a 20-hour flight to solve a problem I had in Moscow with the mayor of Moscow.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And this aspect of personal relationships is obviously a big part of Russian culture and business that usually in smaller, again, maybe in a different level of business, people like to do business with people they know and trust. So that means they went to school with them, or they worked with them, or some way in which they knew each other to vouch for the reliability. They didn't do RFPs like the US does and work with strangers. So,
Yeah, exactly. Let me give you another example. So recently, my son, we wanted him to go to a specific Russian school. And to get that, because we're not in the district for that particular school, the director said, you need to have a recommendation letter from the city of Moscow. So I called my old friend, who's the head of international department of Moscow, Sergei Chiromin, wonderful man who knows us because we were actually he was involved with in the private sector before he went into government, and he was involved with one of our partners called with a group called Sistema.
uh-huh.
He knows us, trusts us. We have helped them by helping the city through the mayor meeting with certain other mayors in cities around the world that we work with, or engaging with international relations. So we've helped them. So when I called him and asked him, could he help out with a letter of recommendation, he was very happy to do so. And, there's no bribery, there's no anything. It's we help them with
Right,
something that's important for them. And then they help me. I mean,
right,
so
right,
that's the kind of, I would say, friendly things that you can have happen if you have people that know and trust you. We found that from the early days with our conference.
yeah,
So I think people have just forgotten that maybe they don't understand from the U.S. perspective, where we have 100 years of jurisprudence and institutions that work and contracts that have worked. In a place like Russia, this is developing, right? The economy is legal system. There's so much that was not formed. It will be 100 years from now, but not
right,
today.
right,
Certainly not 10 years ago or 20 years ago. More so today, but even today, you've got to have people you know and trust, and that you can help them in a very fair and transparent way, and in a likewise fashion, they will do the same for you. And I mean, that's been our experience, and it's
yeah,
you
yeah,
know very
yeah,
successful.
yeah. And so in the earlier days, what the informal meetings, I assume this is, vodka, banya, uh, dacha, food.
A little bit, but I would say it was more than that. We originally, in our first joint venture, we would have board meetings, and we would always do them in nice, sunny, warm places. And so we would go to Cyprus or Bali or Spain or or the Cayman Islands,
Right,
British, actually St. Thomas, actually not the Caymans, but St. Thomas, and we would do these board meetings where we would together would be able to eat, swim. I think the vodka thing is maybe a little bit overblown. We would have that sometimes,
yeah,
and sometimes it would be, you know, I remember one boat trip I took up the Moscow Canal with our partner, and I tried to sneak having a glass of water instead of vodka, but they caught me, and that was off the ropes. The next thing I remember is we were playing cowboys and Indians on the banks of the Moscow River with our ties wrapped around our heads.
yeah. I once took the cruise from Yaroslavl to Nizhny Novgorod that was sponsored by the Yaroslavl Regional Administration and the Chamber of Commerce. I was the only foreigner on board that, and there was, for breakfast, on the breakfast table, the choice of drinks was beer, vodka, or wine. And I quickly realized there was no way I could keep up with these guys, but there was another aspect of it, was of being, nasz человек, being sort of,
Exactly.
which is important, and
Yeah, I think it's critical, and I did the same thing in Sandonie Banya. I don't know if you've been to Sandonie Banya, but I've been there many, many times with our partners. This is like the historic Banya in the center of Moscow that's 150 years old or something.
okay,
It's look it up. It's fantastic, and if you ever come back to Moscow, it is absolutely fantastic. You go into it, and you're like in a 19th century palace kind of thing, and it's the Banya, and and then you beat each other with the birch tree leaves.
right,
Eat
right,
the dried fish and drink some vodka, and yeah,
yeah,
it's fantastic.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I went to one of the historic banyas in St. Petersburg, and at the time I spoke almost no Russian, and I just was looking at people trying to mimic what they were doing, but they had, this very hot, the Russian dry banya, and then they had a
Yeah.
Swedish sauna, and they had the pool. And I left after about 3 hours, and I remember the attendants saying, "Why are you leaving so soon?" But I didn't know anybody, so it was a different experience. But those old historic banyas are, I mean, so important for social life as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets to I think the core of the issue that I think the people have to understand the culture, and they have to really, drink it in and experience that. And if you do that, I think you can be successful. I think when people come and just try to be very mercantilist and very, very commercial only, I don't think that's a way to success in this.
Right.
And the same is true. The same is true about our business in China, and the same is true about our business in India. Like I say I go to our partners' weddings and um, the Vanya and all of these type of things, and that's what I believe really is pretty critical. And back to the political side, I think that's what we're missing as well. And I think people aren't reading enough and understanding guys like George Kennan, who you may know was and I think all of these things matter. I remember at the dinner, I'll never forget this. At this dinner I was talking about with the various ambassadors, one of the provocative questions that James Baker asked the various groups, including the Russian guys and the Americans, what would be the one thing that would say to the counterparty, you're serious about the relationship improving? I think the U.S. ambassador, then U.S. ambassador, said to release Khodorkovsky, who was in prison at the time.
Right.
And I remember it was Oleg Deripaska that said, for the Americans to give the proper respect to the Russians, for the Russians' role in World War II, as we celebrate, I forget which anniversary was coming up. And it really struck me that, this is 2000 and whatever it was. I can't remember, it was 2010 or something, whenever the reset was happening. And I'm thinking, my God, this is, how many, but that's what really was on the mind. And I don't think the average American has any concept that that kind of thing was important to the Russians.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, I'm sort of veering into my personal opinions and not getting, yours, but I just can't. It's sort of, I remember being I think in St. Petersburg or Moscow, when the 300th anniversary of the Russian Navy was being celebrated.
Yeah.
And it was a televised event that lasted the entire day on Russian TV. And I watched a lot of it. And I thought, there's nothing comparable to this in the American experience, except possibly the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And how different this was, and as a unifying concept of the country behind something that 300 years, or, you know, the siege of Leningrad, or, I mean, all these things which we are barely cognizant of, I think, within our education and within our understanding of that country.
I think what's fascinating about it, and what you've seen in like the resurgence of religion, and irrespective of whether you're talking about the Orthodox Church or the resurgence of Judaism or the resurgence of Islam, Moscow's building of the big mosque. I think what people don't really quite appreciate is that Russians are sentimental people, very sentimental people. They're very conservative, and from our experience, extremely loyal. I think that's something that people don't really understand. And I think when it gets down to particularly anything to do with the very challenged times they had in the 20th century, such as the sacrifices they made during World War II, I think people in the US just don't understand how that touched every single family. I mean, you think about the people. World War II was very, very far away from any thinking I had. But my wife's family, or one of her grandmothers was behind enemy lines with the partisans, and basically, ultimately, came back. Another one was in the military, in the Air Force. On and on and on. It touches everyone.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that unfortunately is not really well understood.
Yeah.
And I think the other aspect, if one of your points about, well, how did the failed experiment, or the aspect about, I think I remember when the US was extremely involved in the political behind the scenes in Russia. I mean, I remember the guys that came over with satchels of cash to basically pay people so that Yeltsin, a very unpopular Yeltsin, would win. We're talking about interference in the elections. It was massive.
Right.
American interference in the election. And I think in many ways, certain aspects about the policy kind of maybe crossed the line, not maybe, definitely crossed the line. And I think from that perspective, Russian people probably lost a bit of their innocence in many ways, of their kind of enthusiasm.
Right.
When I think they began to see that politically there would be a lot of steps that would really influence the way the Russians would think. Now, the downside to all of that is that through that chaos, and I remember thinking at the time in the late 1990s, I actually wrote a summary of who I thought the next leader would be. And
After Yeltsin.
And I definitely thought it was going to be a strong man, a guy that was going to be a strong man. And there was a person who I thought was the kind of guy who would be, and he was a general named Alexander Lebed, who was in Transnistria, and he ultimately died in a helicopter accident. He was the guy that I thought could be and might likely be the leader, because I thought it was inevitable that it was going to happen, given the enormous chaos that the Russians experienced in the 1990s.
Right.
And it turned out to be, we thought it was someone that was maybe a little bit more forward thinking than Putin, but then, he was obviously the strong man.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the narrative that sort of forms the background to where I started with the book, is the narrative of we won the Cold War. Russia was coming in as a junior partner to the international order that was dominated by the US. Yeltsin was our guy. He was part of, this romance with America. And that ended. And Russia, well, there were, as some people would have said, stop telling us how to live, was an attitude that developed and that therefore Russia was out of our orbit by the early Putin years. So this is how this narrative of the US as a victim in this process has emerged. It's not a narrative I subscribe to, but it's a narrative that we have to deal with. And I hope in a small way to chip away at that narrative through the book that I'm writing and through the experience of people like you and your reflections on that experience. So I really hope that we can make a contribution to some alternative narrative of this time, so.
I agree with you. And I think on the politics side, definitely the politics have negatively affected us since Crimea and the 2014, et cetera. I mean, that's not been a fun period. The hardest, I would say 93, I kind of think about Russia in three big periods for my time here. 93 through basically 2000, which was the extraordinarily exciting, extraordinarily stressful. I mean, I remember I would come home from work and just lie on the couch watching reruns of, I think it was Bonanza, because I couldn't think. It was just, I was so exhausted because who would get assassinated, what hit would happen, on and on and on. I mean, I remember when I was there when they were firing on the White House, and they had the putsch, and the sniper bullets were going overhead. And I remember in night, I think it was
93.
93, fall of 93.
Yep.
I was on the phone watching CNN when they were speculating whether they were going to call in the tanks. And I was talking to a friend in America, and I said, they're coming, because they were rolling right outside my front door on Leninsky Prospect, and the building was shaking to the point where I thought, well, I need to call CNN and hold the phone out the window and say they're on their way.
Yeah.
But I think so. The three periods were 93 through 2000, then 2000 through 2014, and now 2014 through 21 so far. And I think my fundamental premise is the moment it went wrong was March of 2008, when it was George Bush and Cheney sending the delegation to, I think it was in maybe Budapest, NATO summit, where they effectively announced that they were going to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Again, and that was in March of 2008. That is the moment. That is the moment it went wrong.
Yeah.
Because I think an earlier article, New York Times article by George Friedman, interviewed George Kennan, after they were bringing the Baltic states,
Right.
Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into NATO. And Kennan was just scathing. You got to look up the article. It's a fascinating interview between George Friedman and Kennan, when he was talking about the stupidity of the Western nations led by America at that time. He said, "Don't you understand that you're stepping on the toes. You're treating Russia as if they do not exist, and it will definitely be a bad thing that will go wrong. At some point, there will be a reaction, and it will be a not. And we are being stupid in doing this.
Yeah.
Read the article. But actually, Russia took that pretty well. But in 2008, when they said Ukraine and Georgia,
Right.
it's the moment. It all went wrong. And, then the Georgian war came, short war happened. Okay, we lived through that. Reset happened. It would have probably been okay. But then, obviously, when Ukraine, Maidan, and et cetera happened, that was the moment when, then it became Crimea, et cetera. So
Right.
the other time it went wrong, and I think Biden was probably very correct when he basically was begging Putin not to step back into the presidency after Medvedev. But I think that was really a reaction in many ways to what was seen as a bit of weakness on the part of Medvedev in the Georgian conflict and then ultimately Libya afterwards. And, I just think there were so many missteps where it didn't have to go this way. And I think if we'd had, the wise old men like Kennan or Kissinger or other people like that could have dealt with the back channel discussion, would not have gone wrong. But unfortunately, we're all now paying the price for that. We paid the price commercially, having
Yeah.
an impact on our business, and that's
Right.
terribly.
Right. Do you get pressure to pull out completely because of the political situation?
I would say some of our investors, depending on which investors, some of our investors are unhappy about Russia. Definitely, I would say. I would say the investors that are more understanding right now are groups like the Middle Eastern sovereign funds, who are far more understanding that you don't go from 70 some years of communism to a liberal democracy overnight. And
Yeah.
many of these are not liberal democracies either.
Right.
I would say those are most understanding. My view is that it's not probable we will have North American or Western European investors for probably another 10 years. I think the only investors that will probably have a confidence to do something here will be Middle Eastern or Asian. And, definitely it's not comfortable in the dialogue, because the kind of political dialogue that you and I have had just now will not easily be had with someone that sits in California or
Right.
even, or New York or Florida. You understand why it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. I do.
These people haven't read, George Kennan, don't necessarily ascribe to the realpolitik worldview of Henry Kissinger, and therefore, they don't. No one wants to admit, I would say, that some missteps on both sides have led us to the path where we are politically at this point.
Yeah. 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 I think it's frustrating, and I'm sure you must feel that frustration, that the expertise and understanding of the country that has been developed largely through entrepreneurs and business there is not utilized in the political sphere. It's just not. It's invisible or irrelevant, I'd say. So that's, to me, a serious error.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, I don't really think there's any, there is connectivity between the American Chamber of Commerce and the political sphere. People really don't want to hear it. They frame their worldview, and they don't want to have anything that challenges that worldview. I would say that it's absolutely true with the political class, and mostly true with the State Department as well, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Former Ambassador John Huntston,
Yeah.
he was ambassador in China for 2 years, I think, and then an ambassador in Russia for a couple of years. And he said something to a group that I was listen, part of the American Chamber of Commerce group that I thought was very clever, very wise. He said, you have to understand China and U.S.-China relations will always be able to find their way through because the bilateral trade with China is so enormous.
Mm-hmm.
Business interests are so dramatic that China can threaten Hong Kong, have a genocide against the Uyghurs, can do all sorts of things that are really not that will cause them to be, the worst offender by Amnesty International and human rights, and yet you won't really have the ability to have the kind of pressure on China. This is his opinion.
Right.
The fact that the bilateral trade with Russia and America is so tiny that there's no check on any aspect about the political
Yeah.
shift that happens. And I think that's an unfortunate reality. We don't have that much business between Russia and America. That's
Right.
not true with Europe, and this is why I think the European-Russian relations will improve far more rapidly in the next decade than the U.S.-American relations.
Yeah. 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 So, what would you say are the lasting impacts of our American entrepreneurs, our American entrepreneurial business in Russia as it entered in the 90s and then matured in the 2000s? What's the lasting impact?
I can speak for our company. I think we hope that we have left these cities more beautiful cities. We had some contribution to make there. We've, I think, contributed to the success of Russian partners, success of Russian counterparties, whether it be our partners, banks, contractors, and I think we have hopefully built a class of business people, many of whom have their own companies, own businesses now, that approach things in a fair, honest, high quality, and noble way. And I think we've done that and had success in doing so. I think that will be a lasting impact. The physical realm,
Mm-hmm.
the human realm, and I think that has, we've been able to contribute to that, and I think it will have a very serious lasting impact. Um,
Yeah.
and I think we just take one company, a group called PIK. I was on the board of directors for this Russian company. That's a Russian housing company, and I was involved in the process when they went public, and it was very successful. Then it came down during the downturn, and now it's back up to being the most successful Russian residential development company there is. And I think that's not our company; it's another company,
Right.
and they are extremely successful. So I think those kind of things
Yeah.
have created lasting impact on the cities and that we work in.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Good. Well, I know you've paid attention to the questions that I framed for you, and I don't know whether we've covered everything that you had thought about, and I want to make sure that I haven't left anything out. Do you have other things that I haven't asked you about that you would like to sort of include in this interview?
There's one story that is kind of a fun one. Maybe I'll just tell it to you, and you can decide. So when I came over here in 1993, we did a joint venture with Upadeka. And one of my colleagues that came from Boston, a guy named David Lawrence,
David.
David Lawrence,
Uh-huh.
he was in our New York office at the time, and David was relocating to Beijing, China, another emerging market. And he wanted to call, and he called me up to ask me, what's it like working in this kind of frontier location? And he called me up, and I think I was on the mobile phone. I said, I'm on my way back from a meeting with our partner, Upadeka, about our management contract. And he said, well, how did it go? How was the meeting? I said, well, they said they had two questions. What's management and what's a contract?
That's great.
That to me sums up what it was like when we arrived in 93. Today, there are no questions about what's management, what's contract. And
Right.
I think the institutions that frame themselves, the knowledge set, the human understanding, the everything associated with that data probably is lasting impact. And
Yeah.
through that, we've been able to, I hopefully, I think had some pretty good success. And we were just a contributor in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
There were many other contributors, whether it's, our common friends or others that have, it's, I think even though many people have left, that's the impact. And the people that have continued, I would say that, and I would say the people that have continued, that came engaged and that became engaged and did business with us. Hopefully that kind of impact is a lasting impact that will last generations.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Great. And, probably I'll want to include that little vignette story in the book, because I think it does really capture the times, but it's only going to work if it's in contrast to where they are now, because I don't want to add to stereotypes of unsophisticated and whatever awkward people, because I know that's not true.
No, and I would say now there are many things I learned from Russian counterparts on a daily basis, and we sit down together and decide, choose the architects together, think about design, think about marketing, all of the other aspects that we sit down now with our partners that are as sophisticated, as worldly, as globally knowledgeable as anyone. And I think people that come to Moscow today will see that. And they see, this is why we never hire a foreign contractor anymore, because the Russian contractors are world class. They didn't exist in 1993. Today, they're world class.
Yeah.
That is the difference. And maybe that is the lasting impact for all of us, is that you've got world class quality, world class firms, world class knowledge. And you contrast that with my first story about what's management and what's a contract.
Yeah.
That's the difference.